Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you all today. And I just want to say thank you so much to Charlotte and Helena for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share my work here today. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about how and whether Black Lives Matter has affected racism in education, particularly focusing on social justice, inclusion, and white privilege. So I'm going to talk, first of all, mostly, actually, largely within the UK context, but I am also going to talk about the UK and Europe very briefly. So let's talk about policy making. Policy making in the UK has painted a very positive picture around social justice and inclusion. We had the widening participation agenda, which was introduced by the new Labour government. It's important because it gave students from marginalised communities the opportunity to attend higher education. Policy making we've also had in terms of the Race Relations Amendment Act 2000. The Race Relations Amendment Act is important because it gave us the definition of institutional racism. In 2010, we had the Equality Act, which brought together all previous legislation into one single act. Why is it important? It's important because it includes protected characteristics of which race is one. We've also had policy initiatives in higher education. So we've had the Athena Swan Charter, which works to progress the position of women in STEM subjects. And more recently, we've had the Race Equality Charter, which works to progress, understand racial inequalities in higher education. However, what I'm going to show you today and what I'm going to argue is historically policy making in higher education, race has always taken secondary priority. Race is always at the back of the queue. Gender has always been given precedence, and the main beneficiaries of policy making in higher education have been white women. The main beneficiaries of the Athena Swan Charter have been white women. The main beneficiaries of affirmative action in the US have been white women. Now, we know that there's been an increase in the numbers of Black and minority ethnic students in higher education. Of Black and minority ethnic, within and between, and that's really important. So despite significant advances in policy making and increases in the student body of the BME population, inequalities around race continue to persist. Let me show you the evidence. So if you are a white student, you are more likely to leave university with a 2-1 or a first-class degree compared So there is a BME attainment or an awarding gap of 10.7 percentage points, with the gap being the greatest for Black students and Pakistani and Bangladeshi students, and lower for Chinese, Indian, and mixed heritage students. But what's really interesting about the most recent data is that in 2023, Advance HE, who collects all of this data, said that this marks the first year since 2014 and 15 that indeed the ethnicity degree awarding gap has in fact widened instead of narrowed, and indeed by a substantial amount compared with the smaller incremental decreases that have been seen over the last decade. Now, we don't know the reasons for that. I think the reasons are very complex, but I think COVID has probably had a huge impact on the degree awarding gap. Let's look at staff demographics in the UK. So, excuse me. Of those with known ethnicity, around 12% of UK staff identify as BME. So unlike other European countries, we do collect data on ethnicity in the UK. We have lots of data on ethnicity, not only in our census, which is recorded every 10 years, but also in our higher education statistics. So we know that the proportion of staff who are UK BME has increased from around 5% to about around 10%. So it's decreased. Sorry, it's shown an increase or doubled within the last 10 years. So there's that incremental increase that we can see. Amongst UK academic staff, however, only 6.1% of BME staff are heads of institutions. So out of 154 higher education institutions in the UK, we only have 6 vice-chancellors or presidents who are from a black or minority ethnic background. Furthermore, professors are more likely to be white. Almost 90% of professors are white compared to the smaller numbers that you can see there. And indeed, a larger proportion of white academic staff are on the highest pay spine of around 66k or more compared to BME staff who are doing the same role. So this is an important table I thought I would show you because it shows you the UK professoriate by ethnic group. And these are the most recent statistics that we have. So around 14,500 professors are from a white background and around 1,600 are from a BME total background. Now, if you break those numbers down, you can see there are only 115 black professors in the whole of the UK, of which only 26 are women. So let's talk about white privilege and how that works in higher education. So in my work, I draw upon Peggy McIntosh's work, who wrote about white privilege back in the 1980s. And she argues, white privilege is like an invisible weightless knapsack that white people carry around on their backs. It's got special provisions like maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, etc., etc. White privilege means you can walk through customs without being stopped. White privilege means you're less likely to be stopped and searched by the police. White privilege means you can use a restroom without being arrested. White privilege means you're more likely to leave the courthouse a free man than if you were non-white. And Derek Bell argues, yes, of course, racist hierarchical structures govern all political, economic, and social domains. Such structures, he argues, allocate the privileging of whites in all arenas, including the so-called liberal field of education. However, in my work, I argue that there are different shades of whiteness and white privilege. There's acceptable and unacceptable, legitimate and illegitimate forms of whiteness. So, for example, gypsy and traveller groups who identify and define themselves as white do not have the same privileges afforded to white middle-class identities. So let's talk about intersectionality. It's really interesting that when I give lectures on race and specifically around race and higher education, which is my expertise, and I've been, studying this field for 36 years now, I'm always accused of not looking at intersectionality. If you know my work and you've read my work, you can see that I do actually write a lot about intersectionality. So I thought it was important to have this slide. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term, she argues the intersections of race and gender only highlights the need to account for multiple grounds of identity when considering how the social world is constructed. So, of course, intersectionality is important. And as critical race theory, she argues a focus on the most privileged group members marginalizes those who are multiply burdened and indeed obscures claims that cannot be understood as resulting from discrete sources of discrimination. And Anthea Sewell-Davis argues intersectionality is the most comprehensive, complex, and indeed nuanced concept, and it does not reduce social hierarchical relations of power into one axle of power, whether it's class, race, or indeed gender. However, what I show in my work is that what has actually happened around intersectionality and understanding inequalities and social oppression, white privilege and indeed a hierarchy of oppression has resulted in a discourse of denial, in which I argue gender as a competing identity has always been given greater significance and prominence compared to race. So therefore, of course, an intersectional approach is indeed crucial. So let's look at Black Lives Matter and the impact of Black Lives Matter. So in 2020, George Floyd was murdered by the hands of a white policeman. Now, what was really interesting about the Black Lives Matter protests is that the murder of George Floyd sparked significant European, global, and international attention everywhere. And it is considered to be one of the most significant moments historically in terms of the numbers of people who went out and protested. These are recent figures that have been released by the Washington Post and the New York Times. You know, yeah, okay, we can say what we want about those individual newspapers. But what's really interesting about the Black Lives Matter movement is it impacted every organization, at least not universities. So I remember clearly, and this is when I was doing the research for the book that's just been published, which I'll talk about in a minute, is that many universities quickly rushed to put on their Twitter, X now, and Instagram posts that we are a university that does not tolerate racism. We are a university that has a zero approach to racism. We are a university that acts quickly on any instance of racism. These were the very same universities that did not have one non-white professor in any of their universities. These were the same universities that had the highest BME attainment gap. These were the same universities that had significant numbers of students and staff complaining day on, day out about the racism that they experienced. And I'm going to show you the impact or lack of Black Lives Matter on how racial justice was perceived, particularly in relation to how it moved very quickly from the social arena to the political arena. But what did we find out? We found out that actually white lives matter more. Black lives do not matter at all. So very quickly, the backlash, and when I say very quickly, it was literally, I would say, weeks from my calculations or days in terms of how the backlash immediately followed. So we had these new hashtags, White Lives Matter, all Lives Matter. So there was this backlash against understanding the BLM movement. And in the UK, our Conservative Party also jumped on the bandwagon. So very quickly, the understanding of racial injustice moved from the social arena into the political arena, specifically in the UK and the US. So Oliver Dowden, who was then Secretary of State for Culture, said that museums would no longer receive funding if they took down statues which represented colonialism. Teaching about white privilege and critical race theory was seen as breaking the law, as was decolonizing the curriculum. And schools in England were told by the Department of Education that they would no longer be allowed to teach using materials produced by anti-racist groups. And then Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, "We are proud of this country's culture, its history and its traditions." He suggested that the Labour Party supported those who wanted to pull down statues, to rewrite the history of our country, to edit our national CVs, to make it more politically correct. So the backlash very quickly moved from the social into the political. Now, standing here today in 2025, reading this reminds me or tells me that this is what's happening today. So very little, especially in the US, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So very little has in fact changed even in 2025. And then the backlash continued. Kemi Badenoch, who is a black woman, who was then the Secretary of State for Women and Equality, said, "I want to speak out about a dangerous trend in race relations that has come far too close in my life, which is the promotion of critical race theory, which is an ideology which sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. We should not apologise for the fact that British children primarily study the history of these islands. And it goes without saying that the recent fad," she called it a fad, "to decolonise maths, decolonise engineering, decolonise the sciences that we've seen across our universities, to make race the defining principle of what is studied, is not just misguided, but actively opposed to the fundamental purpose of education." So the backlash against BLM filtered through schools, the Department for Education, and indeed universities. And on and on and on it goes. Those were just the tip of the iceberg. Stories in the press about racism post BLM. So let's talk about racism in education, which continues as business as usual. Delgado and Stefanik argue that when we think about racism, racism is ordinary. It's not aberrational. It's normal science. It's the usual way that society does business. It is, in fact, the common everyday experience of most people of colour in this country, in the US. And we've seen that nearly a third of people from ethnic and religious minority groups reported racial discrimination in education in 2023. Universities themselves admitted in 2020, post George Floyd, that they actually perpetuate institutional racism. And we have huge amounts of research to show us that individuals experience BME students experience racism from their peers, from their lecturers. They are racially profiled. They are continued to be othered. And they also face an ethnocentric white curriculum. Furthermore, ethnic minority students are more likely to drop out of university, and they are more likely to be unemployed 6 months after they graduate compared to white groups. So racism starts at schools, it continues into higher education, and then the trajectory is into the labour market. But it's not just higher education and education where racism continues. Racism in society is business as usual. Most recently, the Metropolitan Police was defined as institutionally racist in the Casey report, which was published in 2023. There's racism in sport and football and cricket. Particularly in cricket, a recent report by the ICEC found that there is evidence of widespread and deep-rooted racism. There's racism in politics. The majority of black and minority ethnic MPs experience racism on a daily basis, and it's much higher for women, particularly people like Diane Abbott and Zara Sultana. There's racism in the media. There are stereotypical images and portrayals of ethnic minorities, migrants and refugees portrayed as criminals, as dirty, etc., etc. There's racism in the labour market. Ethnic minorities are more likely to experience racism on a daily basis. There's racism in housing. Ethnic minorities have the worst housing experience of all groups. They are more likely to live in houses where there is damp and bad conditions which affect their health. There's racism in the health. Ethnic minorities have the worst health outcomes and mental health, particularly they experience racism in the National Health Service. And during the pandemic, it was ethnic minority groups who were the most disadvantaged. They were less likely to be able to isolate, and they were more likely to die from the pandemic, and as a result, experience poverty. So racism in society is business as usual. So just after the Black Lives Matter movement, the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities was introduced by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson to understand how racism worked and to see how the government could actually deal with it. But what was really interesting, interesting is a word that we can use, about the CRED report was that they found no evidence of institutional racism. And I quote, "Put simply, we no longer see Britain where the system is deliberately rigged against ethnic minorities. The impediments and disparities do exist, but they are varied. And ironically, very few of them are directly to do with racism. And too often, racism is the catch-all explanation and can be simply implicitly accepted rather than explicitly examined." For those of us working in this area for many, many years, we were actually quite astounded and insulted that the report found no evidence of institutional racism. There's a huge amount of evidence to suggest that institutional, structural, and individual acts of racism continue to persist in all areas of education. And what the report did was it used a deficit model where it blamed families for their failures, and it conflated race and class and focuses on fairness rather than understanding inequality and indeed issues of racism and social injustice. So I've talked a little bit about policy making, and what I'm going to do is try and understand how that policy making works from a critical race theory perspective. And who benefits from this, from what I call white policy making? So Derek Bell, first of all, he argues, yes, of course, whites will advance the causes of racial justice only when doing so coincides with their own self-interest. So of course universities are going to invest in EDI policies. Of course universities are going to invest in the Race Equality Charter only when doing so benefits them more than the groups to which it is aimed. So this process of interest convergence works to benefit white groups and white groups only. And David Gilbourne argues the continued promotion of policies and practices that are known to be racially divisive testifies to a tacit intentionality in the system, a tacit intentionality in the system. So it's no accident that black students and Pakistani and Bangladeshi students are less likely to leave university with a 2-1 or a first. It's no accident that black students and Pakistani and Bangladeshi students are more likely to be unemployed 6 months after they graduate compared to white groups. It's no accident that black students and Pakistani and Bangladeshi students are more likely to drop out of university, citing racism and ethnocentric curriculum. And Gloria Ladson-Billings argues that whites are the main beneficiaries of educational policy making, even though they are designed to serve the marginalised. So white women are the main beneficiaries of affirmative action, just as white women are the main beneficiaries of the Athena Swan Charter. And I argue that the performativity and enactment of policy making, such as EDI and the Race Equality Charter, it becomes a ritual. It's actually a dance. It's a toing and a froing without actually addressing racial inequalities in any concrete way. So I argue that this deliberate ritual, it works for the benefit of higher education institutions, which reinforce normative practices and ideologies to uphold a system of white supremacy which benefits white groups. So now what I'm going to do is, I hope I've given you some evidence, some statistics and some policy. And now I'm going to demonstrate a piece of research that supports everything that I've just said. So this piece of research is really important because it was carried out post Black Lives Matter, just to examine the impact of BLM. 43 interviews were conducted with ethnic minority students in different higher education institutions, and they all self-identified as either Black, British, British Indian, British Pakistani, British Bangladeshi, and mixed. They were all born in the UK, and they were all in the final year of their undergraduate study. Now, the final year of undergraduate study is a really important transition period for young people at higher education, because there's evidence to suggest that the decisions that young people make at this time has a huge impact on social mobility, future life chances, and indeed access to the labour market. So, yes, of course, students talked about racism, and it's what I call everyday polite racism. So somebody isn't going to come and hit you over the head with a baseball bat and shout racial slurs to you, but they are going to be racist in a very polite way. So Jonathan said, it's here, yes, it's everywhere. It's because the public narrative gives it credence and it allows it to happen. So people think it's okay to be racist. These days, it's more acceptable to be racist. I think the way things have progressed or not progressed around race has made it more okay to say racist things and for people to see it as a legitimate view. And Amrit said, I feel the universities have to be shown to be doing something. But a lot of this is a show. Otherwise, they would be accused of being racist. They pretend to do things to make a difference, but they don't make any real changes. So all the professors here are white. So what has changed? Nothing at all. So students themselves used different coping mechanisms and support in terms of how they try to react against or cope with the racism that they experienced. And Farah, who is from a Bangladeshi background, said, there's a sort of seating plan in all the seminars and the lectures as well. It's not a formal seating plan. It's one that the students have introduced and it's kind of stuck. So yeah, you could say that I do sit with the other Asian girls. It makes me feel more comfortable though, because I know that I won't be judged. I will be accepted. And Troy, he said, I was very annoyed when the woman at the career service said she wasn't sure whether I should do a master's law conversion course. She doesn't know anything about me. All she sees is a black male. She uses that to make stereotypes about what I should and what I shouldn't be doing. That's the subtleties of racism that can knock your confidence. You could say it's actually a microaggression, so that I don't get above myself, if you like. So students also talked about transitionary racisms, where they were very, because of the racism that they experienced in universities, they were very concerned and worried about the racism that would follow them into the labour market or any other decisions that they made. And Valerie, she said, it's very easy for employers to be racist because they can do it in an underhand kind of way so that it can be disguised. They can say, well, you don't have enough experience or you won't fit in with us. These are all ways to say, well, we really don't want you because you're not white. Your face does not fit. And Parminder said that I think having a name like Parminder doesn't really help, does it? I think they'll take one look at my application and say, do we want an Asian girl working here? Even though I could have a first-class degree, they'd rather take the other person. Firstly, you look different because you're not white. And secondly, your name is too difficult for them to spell or to say. So why would they even bother? And we talked about this earlier, didn't we? About how, individuals from black and minority ethnic backgrounds, there's a huge amount of evidence to show that they have to send twice as many CVs as their white counterparts to actually get an interview if their name is not Western sounding. So there's a huge amount of evidence to show that anyway. So ethnic minority students are outsiders within the so-called liberal field of education. They represent a marginal status within higher education. And David Gilbourne argues that conventional forms of anti-racism have proven unable to keep pace with the development of increasingly racist and exclusionary educational policies, which operate beneath the veneer of professed tolerance and diversity. So really, racism continues. I argue that normative hegemonic practices exist in higher education, which follow ethnic minority students during their transitions into the labour market. And ethnic minority students continue to be disadvantaged in higher education, simply because they do not fit in with white normative ways of being and indeed doing. And what does critical race theory tell us? Well, critical race theory reminds us that advances in racial equality, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, they produce no more than temporary peaks of progress. These are short-lived victories. They slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. This is a hard to accept fact that, in fact, all of history verifies. And the interests of blacks in achieving racial equality will only be accommodated when that interest converges with the interests of whites in policy-making positions. So if policy-making benefits white groups more, of course they will invest in it. Higher education in the UK, I argue, is now a market in which race is increasingly treated as a commodity, particularly since BLM. It becomes ever more entwined within metrics which benefit university status rather than simply addressing racism on an individual or collective basis. So where are we today? So we are living, I think, and I'm pretty sure most of you will agree, in times of, certainly in my lifetime, I think we are living in times of risk, fragility, insecurity, both on an economic, political, and social scale. Now, everything has a racial element. That's my opinion. Everything has a racial element, including war. During times of war and conflict, white lives matter more. White lives have always mattered more. So, I think it was last year, the UK government gave families £350 a month if they took in Ukrainian refugees. The UK government doesn't even recognise what's going on, doesn't even recognise Palestinians or what was going on in Syria. Free Palestine, by the way. The humanitarian crisis arising in war zones is not given equal attention unless you are white. If you are not white, the world does not care. And Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the World Health Organization, and I quote, states, "I need to be blunt and honest that the world is not treating the human race the same way. Some are more equal than others during times of war and conflict. Palestinian lives do not matter because they are not white." We've also had the election of Donald Trump as the 47th president in the USA. I'm sure you all noticed that, right? So what's really interesting is that within the first 2 weeks, he signed a significant number of executive orders, some of which were to dismantle all EDI initiatives. He also signed executive orders around immigration, including mass deportations, an end to birthright citizenship. He fortified the US-Mexico border with increased army controls, and he's halted the processing of migrants and asylum seekers. Paulo Freire says that language is never neutral. So if you look at the language that Trump uses, is hugely significant. So these deportations are raids. These immigrants are aliens. They are invading our territories. Language is never neutral. Furthermore, we have the rise of the far right in Europe. And again, it's immigration, threats to identity, asylum seekers. These are things that are used in terms of understanding how the rise of the far right in Europe works. More recently, what's very worrying is the AfD doubled its vote share in the German elections about 2 weeks ago. But we've also had the rise of the far right in Austria, the Netherlands, Finland, Croatia, Sweden, and France. So we live in very, very troubled times, marred by risk, fragility, and indeed insecurity. So these are global racisms. So where are we post-BLM? Racism is only addressed during particular historical moments, I argue. Racism was addressed during the murder of Stephen Lawrence, where we had the Macpherson report, which gave us a definition of institutional racism. Racism was addressed during the murder of George Floyd, where we had BLM. Racism is only addressed during historical moments. When will the next historical moment be? Racism is silenced and then again re-silenced. Race is weaponized. It's used for gaslighting. How do you know it's racism? Where are you really from? Racism is used as symbolic violence. Race is secondary. What about us? We're women. What about us? We're the white working class. Race is a commodity. It's bought and sold for EDI programs within a marketized economy, a capitalist marketized economy. Race is declassed. The white working class is far more oppressed. We don't have working class BME groups. Race has been dealt with. Forget about it. We now live in a post-racial society. I argue these changes are tokenistic. They're tick box. They're performative. And they work for the benefit of white organizations. So racism, institutional, structural, and individual, is deliberately allowed to flourish, to perpetuate a system that benefits whites, to uphold white supremacy. So where are we today in 2025? Are these new racisms, or are they just plain old racisms? So 25 years ago, Bonilla, Silva and Foreman argued, 25 years ago, a new race talk has emerged in the reproduction of white supremacy. It allows whites to appear non-racist, to preserve their privileged status, to blame blacks for their lower status, and to criticize any institutional approach, such as affirmative action, that attempts to ameliorate racial inequality. And in 2011, 15 years ago, 14 years ago, we argued, just after Macpherson, just after the tragedy of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, to argue that post-Macpherson has resulted in a post-racial society is utterly absurd. Such discourses, we argue, serve only to further disadvantage and marginalise black and minority ethnic communities. Racism exists at every level of society. It permeates our schools, our colleges, and indeed our universities. It is alive in all elements of society, our popular culture, our media, and indeed the social spaces that we occupy. And in 2024, I argued, the focus on addressing diversity signifies a retreat from any meaningful engagement with issues of race and racism. In effect, I argue, yes, diversity is recognised, but oppression is ignored. The talk of inclusion becomes a rhetorical victory for universities with bold assertions about the creation of inclusive spaces. I put it to you that these aren't new racisms. This is just racism which continues today as business as usual. And available in all good bookshops. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. This is really interesting. Moa, do you have the ball to throw around? And we start with questions from in the room, I'm thinking. Yeah? So just raise your hand if you want the microphone.
Hey, thank you for this presentation. My name is Leonie, and I am associate professor at this university. We got information, fact, statistic about that race is a problem at university everywhere. But now, what to do about it? How to overcome the situation?
Oh, that's a question to me.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a big question. In this university, what to do about it here or generally?
Generally,
Yeah.
because I know who will answer the question at this university.
Okay.
I don't know to who to.
Yeah, that's a really big question and it's a very important question. So there's lots of different initiatives that we're doing in the UK that are supposed to be addressing issues of racism. So we've got the Race Equality Charter Mark, which is a policy initiative, which I talked about earlier, which works to address racism for students and staff. And one of the other things that we're doing is addressing the attainment gap, the fact that more black students and Pakistani and Bangladeshi students are less likely to get a 2-1 or a first when they leave university. So there's lots of different things that we're doing. So there is understanding assessment, understanding marking processes, decolonizing the curriculum, whatever that means. But what I argue in my work is that these things are performative. These things are window dressing, and they are only done because they benefit the universities, because the universities want to sell themselves as socially just and fair, because they want to attract students who will be paying £9,250 a year, 3 times that if they're international. So you're probably asking the wrong person, because I'm saying that these initiatives are performative. They are showcasing, but they make little difference to understanding racism. They're there for the benefit of the universities, to benefit white groups and uphold white supremacy. So they do exist, but that's my analysis of them. And also there's lots of evidence to show that the attainment gap in universities is bigger. Students complain about racism and nothing is done about it. And so we have structural and institutional racism, which gives individual people, individual white people, a get out of jail free card because they say, it's not me, I'm not racist, it's the structures and the institutions. So nothing changes. That's, sorry, probably not the answer that you wanted, but it is my answer. So
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's a lot of food for thoughts there. Wow, is it really that bad? But the problem is. But you were talking about global racisms. Have you sort of tried to take a more sort of comparative stance here, looking at sort of societies which do not have a European majority? For example, there has been some talk about racism in East Asian, like Chinese contexts, which have been said to be rather bad. So can we see sort of similar trends of subtle or sometimes not so subtle racism permeating even certain non-European, for example, Asian societies?
that's a really good question. Unfortunately, I haven't done any research in that regard, but I think it would be a really good piece of research. My hunch is that there will be parallels, but I don't know whether it would be called racism. I think it would be called, so the discourse and the narrative around it would be different. It may be associated perhaps with wealth, social class, particularly so for example, I am thinking about in the Indian context where one of my PhD students is doing her research, and one of the things that she's finding, it's not racism, it's to do with caste, caste prejudice and class prejudice and wealth. So I think you would have inequalities, but I don't know how the discourse around it would be. And I haven't done the research, but I think it is a good research project to do next. So I'm sorry I couldn't answer your question.
Thank you so much for your lecture, and couldn't agree more on many points that you mentioned. And just a short question, maybe you have some thoughts on it. When we say that most of the professors are white, do they really fit to this characteristic? Because maybe there are, for example, from some kind of migrant family, so they are not sharing this kind of sense. I don't know, maybe their families came from somewhere, but their appearance fits well to this, but still their cultural background is different. But since the appearance is kind of white, people may guess that they are like support this kind of.
So in the UK, they are white British. They are white. So they are white British because the statistics that we have, they can put where they are from. So the data that I showed you, that 90% of the professors are white, and they are white British. Most are white UK born as well. If they're second generation,
yeah,
I don't know. I don't know if they're second generation, but my hunch is that they're white British.
Okay. Yeah, I just meant the quotations from the students, and it's more likely to be their opinion on it, not the statistics they have. Well, that's just some kind of.
Sorry, from the quotes that I gave.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't think I understand your question. Forgive me.
Oh, so students probably have this opinion because they see the appearance, not the statistics.
The opinions
on the professors, that all of the professors are white, for example.
All of the professors are white, though.
Okay.
Because in the UK we collect statistics.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah,
okay.
so the statistics that I gave you. So we've got the Higher Education Statistic Agency, which collects, because I know you don't in Sweden, we collect loads and loads of statistics. So me as an academic, I have to fill in a form every year through my university to give my own demographics, where I'm from. So I will fill that form, and I am not white. I'm Indian, blah, blah, blah. So the statistics, so the figures I gave you are correct.
Yeah, I see. Okay, thank you so much. And thanks for visiting as well.
Thank you.
What does the BME mean?
Oh, sorry, I should have explained. Black and minority ethnic. So it's a term that we use in the UK to define individuals who are non-white. It's not a very good term. I have to say, it's not a very good term. And lots of people use different terms. So they use global majority, people of color. People of color is more American. And the other term is BAME, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. I don't really like any of the terms because they homogenize the groups. And that's why I said at the beginning, it's really important to know that whatever term we use, there's differences within and between that category. So Black students have very different experiences to Indian students. Black students have very different experience to Pakistani and Bangladeshi students. So it's really important that we look at those differences.
Thank you for a really interesting lecture and very important. I was wondering if you have any advices to, like, if we are talking about teaching, or if we are discussing racism in our department, for instance, the Department for Social Work, which I are part of here. I think that we always come back to the question when someone is questioning it and saying, oh, why don't you talk more about gender, and why do we don't put an intersectional perspective on this, which I think is really important, of course, as well. But I think, as you also said here before, that it like turns away the focus on the actual issue on racism. So I was thinking if you have any advices to how we can do to try and keep focus on these specific questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So one of the things that I would say, and this is what I do myself in my own practice, is that, and I don't know if you can do it here because you don't have the data, is I always go back to the statistics. And it's really important when we're making our arguments around race. And this is why you don't have to do this for any other inequality. We always have to show the evidence. Because if I don't show you the evidence, it's just me personal. It's a personal thing. You've got a chip on your shoulder. Move over, Kalwant. It's a post-racial society. So I think you have to go with the evidence and say, well, look, this is the numbers of students that are saying they're experiencing racism. This is the numbers of students who are not leaving with a 2-1 or a first. But what's really interesting is when other people talk about other inequalities, they don't have to produce the evidence because it's a given. Okay, I'm a woman, I'm disadvantaged. Oh, of course you are. So I think it's really important for us as people of colour to go armed with evidence, because otherwise we're not giving the kudos or the respect. And it's always a personal thing if it's about race. If you're a person of colour, it's a personal thing. It's not a global thing. But I hope I've shown you today that it is a global thing. It's not just about me and the racism I experience or you. It's happening everywhere.
I have quick questions from the online. One is Torun, and I am reading her question here. Hopefully you can understand it. Can you say something more about the importance of denial in blocking anti-racist action and progress? I'm thinking about the dominance of, for example, Swedish exceptionalism, the idea that Sweden is above other countries when it comes to human rights and anti-racist ideologies, and how that can hinder making actual changes inside and outside academia. How is a potential UK exceptionalism playing out in the blocking change?
That's a really good question. So I think one of the things that happens with some countries or organizations is this, what I call a discourse of denial, where organizations will look to other things that show that they are addressing issues of social justice and equality. And within that process and that discourse, race always takes a secondary backseat. So race is never considered, it's never at the front of the queue. There's never enough funding for race. There's never enough time for race. There's the policies that address race don't address race. So what happens is racism gets framed within this, we've spoken about it, haven't we? This whole framework of EDI, whatever EDI is. Okay, so there's this, and so within that, it's about racism, but really racism is never addressed. It's always about gender, it's always about class, it's always about disability, etc. So universities can sell themselves and say, well, actually, we are addressing these particular issues because it's in our manifesto or whatever. But in reality, racism is never a priority. And the reason that happens is because universities want to uphold this system of white supremacy, which works to benefit white groups and white students. I hope I've answered the question. I don't know if I have.
Behind you.
Thank you.
Okay, next question. What metrics should university use to measure progress on racial equity beyond simple demographic representation? How can universities address the backlash against EDI initiatives while still moving forward with meaningful equity work?
Again, a really good question. So one of the ways that we can do it, and I talked briefly about, is to address the attainment gap, to see if that attainment gap is changing and narrowing, whether the number of students who are leaving with 2-1 or a first is getting higher or lower. The other way that it can be addressed is to, if you trust the statistics, to have statistics on, or to making it easier for students to report racism and staff, and to address how those incidents are dealt with and how that works out over time. But I think the most significant way in which we can address these issues is through economic and financial capital, because money doesn't talk, money screams. So any institution that doesn't address racial injustice should be financially penalized. And you can bet your bottom dollar your president will stand up and do something about it if he or she knows that that university is going to be economically disadvantaged.
But a follow-up question from me is, of course, that we can't really measure these problems because we don't have that statistics in relation to race or ethnic background. So how do you see that? That a couple of countries like Sweden and Norway have decided not to register this?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? And even France actually doesn't measure ethnicity. France is more kind of, they're interested, I think, is on citizenship rather than your ethnic group. So I think that there's two answers to that question. So on the one hand, you could argue that actually it's a good thing that they don't measure ethnicity because, you know, we see everybody as equal. We see everybody, we have this colorblind approach. We see everybody's the same. But on the other hand, you could argue that that's hugely problematic because if you don't have the statistics, then you can deny that there's a problem. Number one. Secondly, you don't have to address the problem because you can say that, well, actually, we treat everybody as an individual citizen. So I think that there's huge problems that there aren't any statistics. And in the UK, I mean, we have huge problems by any means, but at least we have data which can show us which way the graph is moving. You know, whether things are getting better or whether things are not getting better. So, for example, we have the Office for National Statistics, which is is run by the government, but it collects statistics on everything, on the labour market, on health. So all of the data that I presented around health, etc., that's all from the government. So there's evidence to show that if you're from an ethnic minority background, you're more likely to live in housing that is damp, that is going to cause you health problems. So I can say that because we have the statistics. So I think that it's really problematic that you don't have those statistics. Because where do you start from then? How do you start understanding racism if you don't know where it is or how it exists? So that is a question to you.
One of those that you have to convince.
Okay. No, I know that, yeah. There's a question at the back as well, isn't there?
You still have your question? Yeah. Okay. I was just wondering, you talked about like when universities like perform that they're like anti-racist and like we're taking action and we don't tolerate racism, how to like how you like notice like when it's performative, because we had an incident here at the university a few weeks ago. It was like an aggression against Muslims, like some Qurans were like vandalized, and I don't know, the university like posted like on Instagram about like, oh, we don't accept this, and they basically just said like that they don't accept it and don't tolerate it and that actions will be taken.
But I don't know. It's when I read it, it felt kind of shallow, but I don't know really. And another interesting point that was like several comments that talked about like you don't mention that like this is Islamophobia. Like they didn't say it out loud. And I don't know, people kind of noticed that. Yeah, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think it depends. It's how the university reacts and what they do about it. It's all well and good putting something on Twitter or Instagram saying, like I said, that happened at after George Floyd was murdered. All these universities, you know, I've done research on it. I've looked at what they said and how many said it. We don't tolerate. We have a zero tolerance. But what are they doing about it? Words are cheap, right? Words are cheap. I can stand here and say anything to you. It's what comes out of those actions is really important. And I think what you've said about Islamophobia, it's really, really interesting because this is from speaking to students, is that quite often I think that it's, I don't, well, I do know why actually, is that, you know, people are very reluctant to label something as Islamophobia. And it's very easy to be Islamophobic and get away with it in the world that we live in today for all sorts of reasons that we don't need to go into. So I think that religious racism is on a completely different level, probably because of what's going on in Gaza and Palestine, etc. So I think that there is that reluctance to name it, and then therefore there's a reluctance to shame it. So I think it's actions. What does the university do? Did they do anything about it? Have they done anything about this incident? Do you know?
Sorry, what?
The incident that you just told us about, has anything been done about it? Do you know?
I think if I remember it right, I don't think the university like they didn't write about their actions like on Instagram. It's just that like actions were being taken and they let like what's it called? Like reported it to the police.
Okay.
But yeah, I think a student organization like made a better post in my opinion, and they also talked more about like the specific actions like supervillains increase, I think. I'm not super sure.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. But I also think actually that student voice is hugely powerful. I think that students have a huge amount of power that they don't realize because vice chancellors and presidents will listen to students. They won't listen to us. They will listen to students. Why will they listen to you? Because you're paying money to be at their institutions. Sadly, the university is a business. It's a capitalist, marketized, neoliberal machine. That sounds really negative, doesn't it? And it's also a great place to learn and push ideas and push boundaries and get to listen to, you know, experts in their field. So the university is a great place to be. I'm complicit in it because I work in a university. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to add to that, it's a little bit more subtle, yeah, because the students don't pay fees directly to the university.
Oh,
still,
okay,
yeah.
it's different. Okay.
I think your point's there when you start to look at how capital moves around. I just want to go back to what you and Charlotte were talking about. So I grew up under apartheid in South Africa. Lived in the UK for a long time, been here for 8 years, and this was one of the biggest things I noticed coming here is that you know, the lack of ability to collect statistics without special safeguards. And you couldn't imagine not looking at gender performance, for example, in the same way. And yet at the same time, having grown up where race was such a strong legal category, there's a part of me that goes, oh, that's so nice. And so all I can say about it is that on one hand, where South Africa is now, where it was absolutely shocking to see that the second line of people's CV is their race, because of how the post-apartheid politics have played out, that concretizing categories so much and, you know, reforming at the societal level, it's like power sharing. In the end, there's still something really problematic about it. And particularly if you're the wrong kind of black person from the rest of Africa, it doesn't, you know, it still doesn't help you. And here, I think the problem is that when you look at the students, I noticed around the time of the pandemic, you know, and a little bit after that, a number of them had BLM on their Zoom backgrounds.
They did or didn't?
They did.
Yeah.
And that was super interesting because it was such a difference to the way that it's thought about within the, you know, within teaching practice, I guess. So, you know, it wasn't a big thing here. And so it's always been really nice to see Charlotte working on this stuff. And I do want to go back to class though, and just to say that, accepting your point, but the tables and the slides and the percentages you showed us were about race, and it would have been really interesting to have at the same time looking at the same figures in relation to class and professors. Because I don't know, and I suspect that the gradient of oppression is maybe not as strong in the UK, but I'm sure it's very strong. Mm-hmm. And you know, so having that response and deciding what I don't know what I want to say about it, but just to, you know, to give that back to you, that that in thinking about it, it's about opening these up and looking for opportunities for working together, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I guess the last challenge, I'm not sure you get a get out of jail free card either, because having worked on this a lot, when there's a question about what do we do, I don't know that universities address anything in anything other than the way that you've just been talking about.
Except gender. They've addressed, in the UK, gender has been addressed historically.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I was on an Athena Swan working group for a while, so yeah, I get that.
So let me just clarify what I mean there. So, for instance, if you look at policy making historically in universities, white women have done really, really well, and you can actually trace the numbers of white women that have been promoted to senior positions throughout the last, I would say, 15, maybe more years. And look, let's be honest. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you, but let's be honest here about gender. So, in the UK, this is historical, right? Feminism was not concerned with my mother's experiences. Feminism was concerned with white women's experiences. Probably white middle class, but also white working class, right? So this is a historical discourse that's been going on in the UK. I can't speak for Sweden, where gender has always been given precedence. And you can actually track it the last 15, 20 years. And you can see how white women have benefited significantly in higher education policy making.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, okay, so all I say is in Sweden, I don't think that there's even the same amount of attention given to race at the institutional level, at the discourse level maybe. But I still would feel like coming away from you a little bit happy if there's some idea about what do we do.
What do we do about these social injustices?
Yeah.
Well, I think what we have to do is collectively organize, have a revolution. I mean, you know, come on, what are we going to do that's going to make a difference? I've been through Stephen Lawrence, I've been through George Floyd, I've been doing this for 35 years. Every time a moment happens, I think it's going to change. And we've come full circle, and we are here today where I am talking about Donald Trump getting rid of EDI initiatives. I'm talking about the rise of the far right in Europe and in the world. And I'm 60 years old, and I'm talking about that from when I was doing my PhD. Come on, I don't know what to say. Let's have a revolution. Sorry to be so negative.
I probably what I'm going to say, because you did mention the statistics, right? In terms of when she asked the question, I think I understood where her question was coming from, that with appearances, some student might mistaken certain white-looking appearing people as white, but maybe ethnically they are not considered white. So then maybe the students' assumptions were wrong. That's my understanding of her question. But then you also said there are statistics. So for you to be able to come up with what you said about white professors, is based on demographics or collection of data, like how you fill out your yearly university forms and you have to list your ethnicity or your background. So all these informations have been taken, all this data are taken, and so you have the numbers. And we see that the white English people are on the top. They have the same thing in America. And so we're talking about what do we do? Even though it appears they're doing something about it, I think no matter how many statistics that is collected, how much data is collected, nothing is being done. Somebody just went ahead and canceled DEI and trying to get rid of birthright citizens and say all kinds of crazy things. So all these data and all this information that is being taken, and we can see the graph and all of that. The white people who have the privilege, who are up there, are not going to want to give it up. And they're not going to change. So for me, or in my thinking, all this information that we are collecting, so what? Because they would not do anything about it. Somebody will come with a stroke of hand and change everything, you know?
Exactly that, but also it arms us with evidence. It's ammunition that we can use.
And who do we give that to? Because the person we give it to are the white people in power.
I don't know. We have a revolution.
I think so.
Jag har 2 frågor till.
Okay.
Do you still have your question? Yeah, thank you. Just
Sorry, I
if
haven't
you-
got all the answers, guys. I feel really bad. I'm not that
Thank
clever.
you. Thank you again. And of course, there are many important issues that are under discussion. And I just would like to respond. Yeah, we had a very sad story a few weeks ago. And unfortunately, it's probably, well, not gonna be investigated because we don't have like cameras on campus to find out who was that person. And but right after that, the very day, many of our professors and initiative groups from students, they were interviewed for the national radio, the Swedish radio, and they put a lot of attention of the whole country on this issue, and they made a lot of statements. Of course, nothing left but words, but they did what they could on the very day. And unfortunately, I cannot open this link right now, but well, it's still not something that to be hidden or silent or something like that. And I also know a few of initiatives to support Muslim community here at LNU. They are mostly silent because people don't want to show off, but still it's not as bad. And unfortunately, it will not fix the situation. Even it's not very possible to buy the proper version of the book of Quran text here in Vecchia, for example, because we don't. Maybe it's not the most popular option to buy, but still, I hope that people here share the same values, most of the people outside campus as well. But just a short mention, like the other day that was a cold day and I was wearing a headscarf just instead of another option to not get cold. And that was another guy who was speaking Swedish, and he said something, oh, there are too many Muslims around, just because that was me wearing a headscarf. And unfortunately, this kind of vertical level is probably something that may still be more powerful than we can imagine in outside the campus as well. But still, I would like to say that it's not as bad as could be here on campus, and many people are understand that not be silent is important, but still maybe some decisions and initiatives, they are not very visible and still valuable. Thank you.
And it just in answer to your questions, and that's a really important point that you've just made. Derek Bell, the founder of critical race theory, he says that what we have to do is we have to keep talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that if we stop talking about racism and racial injustice, then the far right have won.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to keep having the conversations. We have to keep talking about it, and we have to keep arming ourselves with evidence and showing this is what's happening, this is what we need to do about it. And by talking about that, I think we can create some sense of unity and community to sort of really arm ourselves with that social networking that enables us to be part of a group that thinks the same way. So Derek Bell would say, keep talking about it, Kalwant.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that issues like that, when we face real issues like Islamophobia, we should act as a community, and
Absolutely.
that's the main point in this case. So we shouldn't be keeping isolated from this kind of problem. Thank you.
We had a question over here as well.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have parallel to what you were explaining about higher education, I was thinking, in the context that you were giving, also about this rearmament that is happening all over Europe, and about the UK sort of being this, taking this sort of leadership role in saying, like, we have this League of Volunteers that will sort of rearm itself in Europe and sort of protect against external threats, let's say. And part of that has to do with investing money in the army, which is another one of the ways in which sometimes us immigrants can access certain societies and, for instance, be given certain benefits, let's say citizenship, let's say education, apart from the traditional, let's say, traditional university path, military path, and going for. And I wonder about the discourse that you're seeing right now in the UK regarding this, as in recruitment, as in where is this going to? I know part of your presentation, but it makes me think about higher education money being taken towards the military instead of towards initiatives in higher education, and if that's perhaps shifting, and how, if perhaps you have seen this before, and how it's sort of coming up now in terms of the discourses, both in terms of trade and military and war in general. Thank you.
I'm looking at Martin because I think, tell me what you think first. I think that what's happening in the UK in terms of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party is that the money is being taken away from people claiming disability benefits. So there's going to be a huge cut in disability benefits, and that money is going to be used for the army, for possible, let's hope it doesn't happen, whatever is going to happen in the future. So I think that Keir Starmer is in a very difficult position, because I think he wants to protect the UK, and he also wants to have his foot in Europe, even though we're not part of the EU, with Macron, etc., and against Trump and Putin. So I think the money is going to be taken. So it's going to be the poor, the marginalized, and probably the majority of ethnic minority communities that are part of that will be the most disadvantaged. So they are going to attack poor, which you would not think a Labour Party would do. Martin, did you want to say anything? Because I don't really know anything else on that. Because I think citizenship is
Thank you. I thought the question about citizenship is really interesting, because one of the sort of the notable failings of British policy has been that that idea, the citizenship that you get through birth and citizenship through marriage and through military service was always one. And there's been a notable sort of succession of events where people who have either fought with the British military or have been of assistance to the British military in all sorts of places across the globe, when it all goes wrong, suddenly those people get left behind.
Yeah.
And very little happens about it.
They get sent back.
Well, it's that, or they're not given
they're not given the benefits
and that's
and the
not
rights,
a new thing. That's something that, if I think about the Gurkhas and the British Army, and that's going back over 100 years, and they still get treated in this, obviously racialized way.
When they need them, they use them.
Yeah.
When they don't need them, they can go back.
So more doom and gloom.
Yeah.
For me. I'm sorry on that.
But that is kind of not in my field of expertise. So I might have given you an inaccurate answer. So forgive me.
Thank you, Professor Kalwant, for such an insightful talk. So my question is related to the Asian students, as you have mentioned in your slides. So how will you understand the interplay of privilege and discrimination in context of a student migrated from India carrying a caste privilege, that is the caste privilege background?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So basically, what's really interesting, particularly about this research, the students that were in a privileged position because they were international students, they still experience racism. And one of the ways, and we found this in our elites book, didn't we, Martin, that one of the ways that they experienced that racism was through the way they spoke. They spoke with an Indian accent. So white students would mock them because of the way that they would speak. But they also experienced other forms of racism because they were not British. So they did experience racism. That's why I say there's different forms of racisms rather than, you can't just look at racism in itself. So they do experience racism, but they're different types of racisms, albeit that they are from a privileged background because they are wealthy or because they come from a higher caste or because they're international students. So that doesn't excuse them from the racism that they experience. So it's that intersectional play, isn't it, between privilege, class, and ethnicity, and how that works out. So when we did our research on elite universities, we found that students who were from non-white students of color who went to elite universities, even though they were in privileged positions because they were in these universities, they experienced a different kind of racism. But some of them, because they were wealthy and because they'd been to private school, they could perform whiteness. So a great example that I use is Rishi Sunak, our ex-prime minister. Rishi Sunak is brown, he's Indian, but he went to the same school as the king or whoever, private schools, but he was able to perform whiteness in such a way that he became part of that group. So there are some people of color who are advantaged because they are able to perform whiteness. Thank goodness I can't do that. So I'm not one of them, so that's how it works.
Two more questions from the online people. This question is, hello and thank you very much for your talk and its directness. I wonder if you have found any interesting and practical example of resistance of work in the terms of how the pushback of whiteness is met. That is resistance of whiteness in terms of anti-racist argument frameworks, collective actions, discourse framing, etc.
That's a really good question. So some of the examples that I've got in the book is where we have collective organizations in communities. So in Birmingham, we have the Saturday School movement that was developed by Kendi Andrews. And so you have these communities that organize themselves, which cater for their own communities and help them through education, through getting access to the labor market. So there are organizations that directly resist whiteness by being all Black or all Asian organizations, and they do that overtly and politically, and to all intents and purposes they work. So many of the Saturday schools that were set up a long time ago in the UK were just for Black children who were being failed by the school system, who were being expelled, who were excluded, who were told that Black children are more like Black and Asian children, actually. Pakistani, Bangladeshi children are more likely to be diagnosed with special educational needs, for instance, and they are more likely to be excluded. So we had resistance through organizations that helped these children get back on track in schools. So they work.
And another one. Any examples of structural changes that UK university has successfully implemented post-BLM?
No. Sorry, afraid not. If you know of any, let me know, whoever that was. I'm afraid not. I mean, you know, what can I say? We try. We, you know, there's some things that I've done in my university, in my college. We have a college where, you know, I've asked students what they want, what they feel about the organisation in terms of what we can do to help them. And we've created safe spaces for our students, but whether they have made any difference, it's too early to tell. But I would say a blanket no. It's performative.
We need another question because that cannot be the last.
No, we need a good question, a positive question to end with. Okay, so well, I can end on a really good positive. Okay, go on.
I mean, it's not a question, but it's just to come back to race and class and to Sweden. And the thing that's happening here, in my observation, is that class is coming back in ways that people aren't. It's patronized, but really equipped to deal with in society in the way that, say, in the UK, there's much more consciousness of class, and so it becomes some. And the thing that you see here in schools is that in terms of oppression and people being held back, there's a big overlap between immigration status and class. And the problem of holding them separately, I'd say, is that there's an opportunity there for revolution or at least struggle. But that one of the big societal moves is always to split working class people from people of color, or however you want to define it, and say, well, you know, those are different struggles. And coming back to Rishi Sunak, maybe they're not. Maybe whiteness, if you can perform it like that, it's about power, isn't it? And
Power
how we
and
deal
wealth,
with that
yeah.
as a society.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, that, you know, in the UK, apparently the white working class are the most oppressed at the moment. And apparently they're far worse off than the students that I speak to who are from poor, marginalised, non-white backgrounds who experience racism every single day of their life, walking down the corridor, going to the shops, etc. But let's end on a positive note. Let's say that we can fight the struggle together. You know, we can come together and try and move forward and try and make the world a better place. Free Palestine. Thank you.